Hello, my name is Dr. Christopher Gennari, and this is Great Big History Podcast. History 101, Episode 13, Egypt and the Problems of Paradise. So our big question is, how do you gain legitimacy when life is good? Because that's where we're going to start, is that Egypt was the best place to live in the ancient world. And to be honest, pound for pound, ancient Egypt might be the best living humans ever did in a society. So we talked about this in the time video, and we're going back in time to talk about Egypt. So we started with Mesopotamia around 5000 or so BC, and then we talked about Babylon. Then we talk about the Bronze Age collapse that runs right through everything because everybody collapsed. We talk about Assyria, Persia. Now we're talking about Egypt. And then we'll talk about the Hebrews. But the Hebrews are Mesopotamian, culturally speaking, and part of the Mesopotamian world. And so even though we put them after Egypt, they could easily go with the Mesopotamian world. So when we talk about Egypt, we have three kingdoms: the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom, separated by a first intermediate period and a second intermediate period. Well, how would you like to be living in the second intermediate period? The point of these are that the kingdoms are good, they're organized, they're stable, while the periods are bad. And obviously this is all modern naming conventions. No one was alive thinking they were in the first intermediate period. But the periods are bad and the kingdoms are good in Egyptian history. That's the part you need to know. So let's talk about geography. So this episode is going to be on geography. And the first thing is, Egypt is weird. Ancient Egypt, remember, not modern Egypt, ancient Egypt. It's in northeastern Africa. But because of the geography we're going to talk about, it's in Africa, but it's not African. And I'll always get students who go, wait, what? Huh? The Egyptians and other ancient world people thought of Egypt as its own continent. It was its own place. And we'll talk about why. That's the major part of geography. That a lot of it is cut off from other peoples. So the Egyptians thought of themselves as different from everyone else and separate. They didn't think of themselves as part of a much larger continental system, the way the Mesopotamians had to. Right? The Mesopotamians go up the rivers and then they meet the Hittites. There's not a lot of geographical separation of different Mesopotamian peoples, much less from settled people to nomadic peoples. Remember, we started talking about how nomads affect settled peoples. So for Mesopotamians, we call it the Fertile Crescent, we call it the known world. There's a lot of interactions with other peoples, whether they're India, the Hittites, nomads in Bactria, people in the Levant. Egypt, on the other hand, is Egypt. And it doesn't have a lot of interactions with other places. It is also the oldest continuous civilization in the ancient world. There's 25 dynasties before the Greeks even ever show up. Now, China will lay claim to like the oldest continuous civilization. And that's fair. The dynasty system runs from the mid 200s AD, BCE to 1911. But in the ancient world, where you have all of this turmoil, all of the Bronze Age collapse, all of this death and destruction, Egypt just kept on chugging. So they had 25 dynasties. Dynasties is a family. who runs the groups. So they can last hundreds of years. They had 25 before the Greeks even show up. Egypt is so old. Here's one way a professor put it. Egypt is so old that I am closer to hanging out with Cleopatra. We are closer to hanging out with Cleopatra than Cleopatra was to the building of the pyramids. That's how old Egypt is. So why does it not feel connected to the rest of the ancient world? Well, it's geography. And there's two parts, and one creates isolation and the other creates connection. And you could see from the map where already you can kind of see what the difference is. What would cause the isolation? What would cause the connection? If you're watching the video, I have a map of essentially modern Egypt. And you get the deserts and the Nile. The Libyan desert to the west, the Sinai desert to the east, and you have the Nile cataracts. And that equals isolation and protection. The deserts plus the cataracts equal isolation and protection. So we have to kind of talk about the cataracts. What are cataracts? Well, if you have your grandmother or grandfather, or maybe yourself, you know a cataract is a blockage. In fact, you could see how it's pre-medicine, right? There's a scientific Latin word for a cataract, but no one uses it because we have used cataract for as long as people have had eyes, because in the ancient world it was based on these. It means blockage. So people said, oh, it's a blockage in the Nile. Oh, it's just like the blockage you can't see on your eyes. So we use this pre-scientific language. And what cataracts do is block the flow of the Nile, making shipping very hard. It makes sea trade very difficult. The first cataract is these giant boulders, these giant islands that you have to navigate through. The second cataract is a giant waterfall. Well, you would have to take your boat and all of your equipment and all of your sailors and all of your things you want to trade, put them back onto land, go to the bottom of the waterfall, figure out a way of getting them down a waterfall, then put them back. It's just too difficult. It's hard to do. And it's slow, and it's expensive, and it's time consuming. And so what the cataracts create are borders. They create borders of empires. From the sea, from the Mediterranean Sea to the first cataract, you end up with Egypt. From the first cataract to the second cataract, we get this frontier. Now, that frontier will be battled for a little while, and the new kingdom will take it over, and then Kush will take it over. But it's a frontier. If you didn't want to live under the pharaoh, and you didn't want to live under an African Kushite king, there was this frontier between the first and the second cataract where you could go. And you could kind of be on your own. Carve out a life. It's like the northern Tigris in a lot of ways. From the second to the third cataract, you get Kush. From the third to the fourth, you get a kingdom that rises up called Napata. You know, Kush and Napata are African kingdoms. These are black African, sub-Saharan African kingdoms. So, that isolation and that protection allows for a couple things. First, Egypt is not invaded for thousands of years. You can't march an army. Because of the cataracts, you can't march an army down the rivers. And because of the deserts, you can't march an army across the deserts without a navy. And no one has a navy big enough to carry all the water that an army of 40,000 people would need. So Egypt's not invaded, which means it has no army, which means it has no city walls, which means it has no trauma. And life is great. Now, I want to point this out. If you put on your tests, a problem with Egypt was it didn't have an army, I will mark you wrong, because they weren't invaded. It wasn't a problem. Why do you need an army if you're never going to fight? You don't need city walls because there are no nomads. So there is no trauma. So life is great. But oh. This creates a homogeneous culture, which is efficient. Like the people who live from the first cataract in the south to the delta in the north are Egyptian. They're going to be Egyptian. They're going to speak the same language. They're going to have the same customs. They're going to kind of follow more or less the same laws. They're going to use the same weights. Like a pound is a pound in that 900-mile area. A meter is a meter. Everyone agrees. So you get this homogeneous culture, which is why, one reason why Egypt is technically in Africa, but it's Egyptian. It doesn't think of itself as part of a larger continental system because it's a homogeneous culture for the most part. That doesn't mean there's no contact with anybody, and we'll talk about that. That doesn't mean nothing sleeps in, but also it means Egypt is behind in writing, in the invention of money, in metal use. They have no horses. They have for war or for labor. So they're behind what's going on in other places. It's not a problem because it's Egypt and they're not being invaded. But despite their wealth, despite their size of their population, they are always behind what is going on in Mesopotamia. Because Mesopotamia is this turmoil, this tumult of all of these people, of all of these ideas, of all of this murder and destruction and change. It's all change. And in Egypt, it's much more sedate. But there are connections, as I mentioned. The delta, these are our two, if you're watching the video, there are two, there's two little yellow dots. But basically, there's only two connections to the ancient world. There's one in the delta, and that's a connection basically to the Phoenicians, the early sea traders. And from the Phoenicians, Egyptian wheat and goods can go to the rest of Mesopotamia, and Mesopotamian goods can come in. But that's one connection. And then there's one at the first cataract, which is your connection to Africa, which is up the Nile River. So if you could get trade and you went up the Nile, remember the Nile runs from south to north. It does not like the Mississippi, which runs from north to south. It runs from south to north. So Upper Egypt is southern Egypt. It's one of the few rivers that runs south to north. So in upstate New York, we have the Genesee River, which does the same. It's one of the few rivers that runs south to north. But there's only really two connections in Egypt to the outside world. So Egypt can keep foreigners out. And foreigners don't need to go. Why would you need to go to the middle of Egypt? You show up at the trade zone in Thebes at this first cataract. There's a giant market. You sell your goods. People buy your goods. You make money. You get to go back home. Why would you want to go to the rest of Egypt? You've sold all your goods. And the Egyptians, those merchants, will go north into Egypt and sell the goods as they go along. It's the same with the Phoenicians. So there is trade, but it's mostly kept on the outside. You could live your entire life and never meet a foreigner as an Egyptian if you lived in the center of Egypt. Most people would never have met a Mesopotamian, a Phoenician, an African, a Cushite, a Nepontan. So there is access to outside goods. And they could always trade for food, money for food. The Egyptians, we're going to talk about why, but the Egyptians always have money. They're the richest people of the ancient world. We're going to talk about why in a little bit. Because they sell food and everybody needs food. And they have more food than any place else. And every other place needs food. So they have money. And this trade and this money allows them to catch up from time to time. But then they will Egyptianize the thing that they were behind in. So the Egyptians are not inventing a lot of things. Now there's some science and some more sedate things. But cuneiform is a good example, right? Cuneiform is the first writing script. It's invented in Mesopotamia. The Egyptians take cuneiform, which means wedge. It's used. It comes from the tool, the kind of pencil. It's a tool, a little wedge that you would use into the clay. And what do the Egyptians do with it? They take it, and then they create hieroglyphics. Now, the big thing about hieroglyphics is people think, oh, it's telling a story. Like, the raven is a raven. It's not. It's actually a language. It's actually an alphabet. And so there are stories of like when Alexander gets and the Romans get to Egypt and they take a look at these hieroglyphics and they're like, you're an Egyptian. Tell us what it says. And the Egyptian is like, well, you see the raven and the guy, and he doesn't know because it's a form of an alphabet. And the Egyptians long lost how to read the hieroglyphics because it was 3,000 years earlier than Alexander. You know? It's like giving me cuneiform and saying, okay, read it. I don't know. There's a cow, and the cow is a person, and you like. But Alexander's standing there going, that's what I thought. And they're like, you're a great king. He's like, I am a great king. Let's go defeat the Persians. So that brings us to the Nile. So the deserts and the cataracts equal isolation and protection. The advantage, stability. The disadvantage, you're behind. The Nile is the longest river in the ancient world, and it equals life. It equals Egypt. It creates Egypt. In the same way it will create Kush, in the same way it will create Napata, and you could see it today. Here on the video, there's the satellite picture. You could see where the green is. That's where the food's. That's where the Nile is. Now the Nile is a blue part going through that as a river, but it's surrounded by all these farms. On the right is cities. Is where people live at night. Is where people live. It's the lights at night, and you could see there's the delta and there's the Nile. You could see exactly where the Nile is and where the deserts are. The people live on the Nile. Egypt only exists because of the Nile. So what does the Nile allow for? It allows for communication, connection, at least from delta to cataract, at least from the sea to the cataract. From cataract to cataract, you can easily go from place to place. So it creates a nation state, a natural nation state. That doesn't exist in Mesopotamia. Babylon is a natural city. It's the natural place to put a city. There is a city where Babylon is as long as there have been cities. Today it's Baghdad. But in the confluence of the Tigris and Euphrates, it is the logical place, both north, south, and across from river to river, the logical place to put a city. And so Babylon is always a big city. Whatever's there, Babylon, Ctesiphon, Baghdad, always a big city. But Egypt has a natural border. It has the sea in the north. It has the first cataract in the south. Now Egypt will absorb that frontier land between the first and the second cataract as kind of a buffer state to keep African kingdoms and enemies away. But in the ancient world, that first cataract equaled the end. You hit the cataracts and you went past that, not Egypt. So that allowed for cultural borders. It allowed for a nation state. It allowed for a king to say, this is what I own. Egypt is this. Egypt is the Nile River from the delta to the cataract. And so it makes life efficient. It's organized. And it allows for wealth. Because the biggest thing that hurts wealth is friction, is borders, is things that stop people from moving, things that stop money from moving. And you know this because this is how capitalism works. We're constantly trying to break down friction so that it's easier to spend money from place to place to place. Right? Now we see that immigration is still a problem, right? Immigration is still a friction, moving from place to place. This is what the European Union is trying to allow for people to move from place to place to place and to mix. And of course, conservatives don't like that, or cultural conservatives don't like that, because they like their borders. They like to control what's inside of those borders. And if you just allow immigrants in, it changes the culture. And if you're a cultural conservative, you don't want your culture to change. But it also hurts your wealth, because you would have less people mixing, doing things, working, finding new jobs, creating new wealth. So whereas Babylon allows for that kind of frictionless cultural economy, or close, especially after Hammurabi's law code, kind of puts in the rules that everyone has to abide by. Because otherwise, if you read your Old Testament, there's lots of friction. Like the Hebrews talk about all of these people, they're all speaking different languages, there's a lot of mess in Babylon. And so part of what Hammurabi's trying to do is limit that mess to make it more efficient. Egypt doesn't have that. Egypt is efficient because Egypt has a clear cultural border. Everyone between the Delta and the Cataract will be Egyptian. They'll follow the same government. They'll speak the same language. They'll use the same law. They'll use the same money. They'll use the same weights, right? In the Delta, you go, 1 cow is worth 10 chickens. Well, you go up to the first cataract, 1 cow is worth 10 chickens. So wealth, prosperity, peace, you get the advantage of size and scale, which is what companies are always trying to get. They're always trying to get bigger because there is an advantage. Things get cheaper. Things get easier. You make more money. You bring your business to scale. Size, and Egypt has it. Egypt will have the most people in the ancient world. Egypt will have the largest economy in the ancient world. If someone could unite the Nile from the sea to the cataract. If you can't unite from the sea to the cataract, then you have all these kingdoms like Mesopotamia along the river, and it's a mess. It's all war, it's all destruction. Guess what the first intermediate period is going to be? Now, contemporary African kingdoms like Kush and Napata, which are almost as old as Egypt, that is very important. They grow up alongside Egypt. They will dominate from cataract to cataract. So you get Kush. And if they could unite cataract to cataract, the second to the third cataract, they had all of the same efficiencies. So from Egypt well into Africa, you get a series of kingdoms that are essentially act and look like nation states in a way, because the culture, the law, the money, the language are all efficiently distributed and unified. So it's not quite a country, but you have your borders. You know what the people in it know who they are and who they're related to. Whereas in Mesopotamia, there's constant mixing. So the Nile is going to create a lot of wealth. Egypt will be the wealthiest place in the ancient world. Why? Because it floods. For 3 months, every year, from May to September, the Nile floods, and everything is 10 feet underwater. Everything. So is this a trauma? In Mesopotamia, we know it's a trauma, right? We have the flood story. We have the Gilgamesh flood story. The Hebrews will have a flood story. Everybody will have a flood story. And they're always bad. There is no Mesopotamian flood story that's good. All Mesopotamian flood stories are bad. So that would make sense, right? The Egyptians have a Nile. The Nile floods every year. Obviously, this is a trauma, right? Nope. Why? Because it's predictable. Because you know in May of every year, the Nile is going to flood. So you could prepare for it. You could build dikes, you could build channels, you could build canals, you could try to direct. You can't direct all the water because we're talking trillions of gallons of water, right? But you also know everything's 10 feet underwater. Where do you build your house? Well, like in New Orleans, you build it 11 feet in the air. You know how high the flood's going to get, so you build your first floor 11 feet in the air. You're fine. It's predictable, so it's not a surprise. Mesopotamian floods are a surprise. Mesopotamian floods happen and wipe things out because no one's prepared for them. Mesopotamian floods hit like Superstorm Sandy that just wiped out. My brother who lived in Manhattan talked about how he looked into the elevator shaft and just watched water just pouring in. And that was going to fill up the first 2 floors of their apartment building. Just water just pouring in. That the underground car parks were all flooded to the ceiling. That the water went everywhere. Why? Because Manhattan doesn't get flooded. It doesn't get hit by hurricanes very often. And it doesn't get flooded by nor'easters, like, at all. You know. Okay, some of the beach settlements do. I remember out on Long Island that a whole new channel opened up, that the storm just punched right through the beach communities between the ocean and the bay and just punched a hole into it. That must have freaked out all the freshwater fish that suddenly had to breathe salt water. They were not happy about that. But it took a year or 2 to build a bridge to connect those beach communities again. But no one expected that. And then like, oh my God, we have to build a bridge. You know? So the predictability of the flood means it's not a trauma. And the flood itself is full of rich sediment. Dead plants. It's all fertilizer. Dead animals, dead plants, dead fish. All the poop from all the things that live in the water. All that gets churned up. All the mud. And that's rich sediment. The point of that is that when the flood finally receded in September, you were left with very rich earth. Very rich ground. So that Egyptians could get 3 to 5 harvests a year in 9 months of work. Now, that's a very important part. Remember, for 3 months, you are on vacation. You cannot work. There is no job. So take your Protestant work ethic and be like, well, I have to keep working. I have to make money. No, everything is 10 feet underwater. There is no job. You know, it's time for you to be in quarantine, to have nice time with your wife and your kids. That's what you're looking at. And it didn't matter because in the 9 months of working that you had, you got 3 to 5 harvests. Now, that only matters if you know what everyone else has. And the typical Mesopotamian farmer got 1 harvest. Maybe in a good year, 2. And they had unpredictable flooding. So the average Egyptian farmer, what does this mean? And this is the kind of thing what I'm trying to teach, is that you see this and you go, the average Egyptian farmer is 3 to 5 times wealthier than the average Mesopotamian. And works 3 months less per year. They are 300% richer by working 1/3 less. So what does this tell you about how Egyptians feel about life? Well, the answer is they love life. Because they're showered in money. 3 to 5 harvests. Like, think about that. You sell 1 harvest. You eat one harvest and you save one harvest. Okay, that's great. Then year 2. Well, you've already saved one harvest, so you don't need to save another one. I mean, you could if you really want to save up. But that means now you eat one harvest. You could, if you had, say, 5 harvests that year, right? Save one harvest. So now you've got 2 in savings, right? Now you got 2 years in savings just in case something bad happens. But now you can sell 3 harvests. So whereas a Mesopotamian ate their harvest and sold the little they had extra, the Egyptian, in our example, ate 2 harvests, saved 2 harvests, and sold 4 harvests. So they're more than 400%. They're 400% richer. And they're better fed. And they worked less. So how do they feel about life? They love life. Life is great. Ancient Egyptian writing is all about how awesome life is. What about the gods? The gods are awesome. The gods are great. Why? Because the gods love us, obviously. They let us live in Egypt. They gave us the Nile. We have 5 harvests a freaking year. In American concept, that's like earning $250,000 a year. The average American earns about $50,000. So the average Egyptian, for 9 months of work, earned $150,000 to $250,000. Wouldn't they like life? The answer is yeah. Yeah. The gods are great. The gods love me. Obviously, the gods love us, right? The gods are good. The gods love us. So we like life. We love the gods. The gods love us, which is very different from Mesopotamia. In Mesopotamia, the relationship between the people and the gods are kind of abusive. The people are like, here's your sacrifice, you bastard. And the gods are like, thanks, asshole. And then they smoke on their little cigarette and go, we'll see what you get. We'll see what you get this spring. We'll see. See what we do for you. And the Mesopotamians are like, yeah, we'll see. Thanks. You know, it's all passive aggressive. We'll do it for you, but we don't expect much from you. Like the Phoenicians have murder gods. Like they have gods that demand child sacrifice. How nice can those gods be if they want to eat your children in order to make the harvest grow? Think about that. Is that a nice God? Hey God, what do you want this year? 3 babies. Yeah. But, you know. So, in Egypt, the gods are good. The people like the gods. They're wealthy. Life is good. How about legitimacy of government? Well, you don't get invaded. The people are making money. What job does Pharaoh actually have? What job does the government actually have? And that's the uh-oh. And that's what we're going to talk about in our next lecture. We're going to talk about how Old Kingdom governments, or how Egyptian governments, try to figure out what is the point of government when everything is good, when life is good, when the gods are good, when life kind of just runs. How do you create a legitimate government? And that's what we're going to do next time with the Old Kingdom. Take care, be safe, stay healthy. See you soon.